In a quiet African village surrounded by tall trees and wide fields of red soil, there stood a small cluster of simple mud huts. The village was peaceful, and the people lived a humble life. Every morning, the warm golden sun rose over the horizon, lighting the dusty roads where children played and villagers walked to their daily work. In one of those small huts lived a young woman named Amina. She was poor, but she had a very kind and gentle heart. Amina had married a hard-working young man from the village, and after the wedding, she moved into his home. However, the house was also ruled by her husband's mother, a woman known by everyone in the village for her strict and harsh nature. From the very first day Amina arrived, her mother-in-law treated her badly. She gave her endless chores and never seemed satisfied with anything she did. Every morning before the sun even rose, Amina had to wake up and begin her work. She would sweep the dusty yard, fetch heavy pots of water from the distant river, cook meals over a clay stove, and gather firewood from the nearby forest. Despite all the hard work, the mother-in-law constantly complained. She would scold Amina and say that she was lazy or useless, even though the young woman worked harder than anyone else in the house. Still, Amina never argued or spoke back. She believed that patience and kindness were stronger than anger. Even when her heart felt heavy, she continued to do her work quietly, hoping that one day things would change. Little did she know that fate was already preparing a moment that would soon change everything in the village. Life in the small African village was simple, but for Amina, every day felt like a difficult test. Her mother-in-law was known throughout the village for her harsh temper and unforgiving nature. While other families lived peacefully, Amina's home was filled with constant criticism and endless work. Before the first light of dawn touched the red earth, Amina was already awake. The rooster had barely crowed when her mother-in-law would shout from inside the hut, ordering her to begin the day's chores. Amina had to sweep the entire yard, cook breakfast on the clay stove, and then walk a long distance to the river to fetch water in heavy clay pots balanced on her head. The river path was dusty and tiring, but Amina never complained. After returning home with water, she was sent again to gather firewood from the forest. The bundle of wood was often bigger than her own strength, yet she carried it quietly back to the hut. But no matter how much work she did, it was never enough for her mother-in-law. The old woman constantly found something to criticize. If the food was slightly late, she would shout. If the yard was not perfectly clean, she would accuse Amina of being lazy. Sometimes the neighbors could hear the harsh voice of the mother-in-law from outside the house. They felt sorry for Amina, but the young woman never spoke badly about her husband's mother. She simply lowered her head and continued her work with patience. Inside her heart, Amina believed that kindness would one day bring goodness into her life. She did not know when that day would come, but she held on to hope. Meanwhile, her cruel mother-in-law had no idea that her behavior would soon bring a powerful lesson, one she would never forget. Even though Amina lived a very difficult life in her small African village, she never allowed bitterness to grow in her heart. Her days were filled with hard work and harsh words from her mother-in-law, but she always chose kindness over anger. Every morning after finishing her chores at home, Amina would walk through the village carrying clay pots or bundles of firewood. As she passed the small mud huts, many villagers noticed her gentle nature. She always greeted the elders respectfully and spoke kindly to everyone she met. If an old woman in the village needed help carrying water, Amina would stop and assist her without hesitation. If children were struggling to gather firewood, she would share some of her own bundle with them. Even though she had very little for herself, she never hesitated to help others. The villagers often whispered among themselves about her good heart. They wondered how someone who faced so much hardship could still remain so humble and caring. Some people even felt ashamed that they complained about small problems while Amina carried such heavy burdens every day. One afternoon, while walking back from the river with a large clay pot of water balanced on her head, Amina noticed a tired traveler sitting under a large tree beside the dusty village road. The man looked weak and thirsty, as if he had been walking for many hours under the hot African sun. Without thinking twice, Amina quickly walked toward him. She carefully lowered the clay pot from her head and offered him cool water to drink. The traveler looked at her with surprise and gratitude. He had not expected such kindness from a stranger. But what Amina did not know was that this small act of kindness would soon change her life forever and reveal a truth that no one in the village expected. The hot African sun was shining brightly over the quiet village road. Dust slowly moved through the air as Amina stood beside the large tree where the tired traveler was resting. The man looked exhausted, his clothes covered with dust from a long journey. Amina gently held out the clay pot and said politely, "Please drink some water. The sun is very strong today." Her voice was soft and respectful. The traveler looked up at her with surprise. He had been sitting there for a long time, yet many people had passed by without noticing him. But this young girl, who clearly had very little herself, had stopped to help him without hesitation. He slowly took the clay pot and drank the cool water. After a few moments, the tired look on his face began to fade. The water had refreshed him, and he felt grateful for the girl's kindness. "Thank you, my child," the traveler said warmly. "You have a very kind heart." Amina smiled politely and shook her head. "It is nothing," she replied. "Anyone who is thirsty deserves water." The traveler carefully observed her humble clothes and the heavy clay pot she carried. He could tell she lived a difficult life, yet there was no bitterness in her words or her expression. Before leaving, the traveler asked her a few gentle questions about the village and her life. Amina answered honestly, but never complained about her mother-in-law or her hardships. The traveler nodded thoughtfully, as if he was quietly understanding something important. What Amina did not realize was that this traveler was not an ordinary man. He was actually a respected village chief from a nearby region, traveling through the villages to learn about the people. And after seeing Amina's kindness, he decided that very soon he would return, this time with a plan that would change everything. The next morning, the quiet African village woke up to an unusual sight. Dust rose along the red village road as several riders and villagers approached from the distance. In the middle of them walked the same traveler whom Amina had helped the day before. But this time, he was not dressed like a tired wanderer. He wore fine traditional clothes, and several respected men walked beside him. The villagers quickly gathered in the center of the village, whispering among themselves, wondering what was happening. Amina was also surprised when she saw the traveler again. She stood quietly near the back of the crowd, holding a clay pot in her hands. Her mother-in-law stood nearby, looking curious but slightly nervous. Then one of the elders stepped forward and spoke loudly to the villagers. "People of the village," he said, "the man standing before you is not an ordinary traveler. He is a great chief from a nearby region, a respected leader who has been traveling to learn about the people in different villages." The villagers gasped in shock and quickly bowed their heads in respect. The chief then stepped forward and spoke in a calm but powerful voice. "Yesterday, while traveling through this village, I was very tired and thirsty. Many people passed by me on the road, but only one person stopped to help." He turned his hand toward Amina. "This young woman gave me water without asking for anything in return." The crowd began to murmur in admiration. The chief continued speaking. "But while speaking with her, I also learned that she lives a life full of hardship and cruelty inside her own home." Slowly, the eyes of the villagers turned toward Amina's mother-in-law, who suddenly felt very uncomfortable. The truth was about to be revealed, and the wicked mother-in-law had no idea that her actions were now known by everyone. The villagers stood quietly as the chief looked around the crowd. His voice was calm, but it carried great authority. Everyone in the village respected him, so no one dared to interrupt. The chief slowly stepped forward and pointed toward Amina. "This young woman showed kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return," he said. "Even though she lives a difficult life, her heart is full of goodness." The villagers nodded in agreement. Many of them had already seen Amina's kindness before. They knew she worked harder than anyone else in the village. Then the chief turned his eyes toward Amina's mother-in-law. "But I have also heard something troubling," he continued. "A person who is kind and hardworking should not be treated with cruelty." The crowd became silent. Amina's mother-in-law suddenly felt nervous as many villagers looked in her direction. The chief spoke again, his voice firm. "A home should be a place of peace and respect. When someone uses power to hurt others, it brings shame to the family and the village." Amina's mother-in-law lowered her head. For the first time, she realized that her behavior was being seen by everyone. The chief continued his lesson. "Kindness is stronger than cruelty. A person who spreads goodness will always earn respect, but a person who spreads harshness will eventually face the truth. The villagers murmured in agreement. Some elders even nodded their heads wisely. Standing in the center of the crowd, Amina remained quiet and humble. She never asked for revenge or punishment. But the message was already clear to everyone. For the first time in her life, the wicked mother-in-law understood that her actions had consequences, and that the whole village now knew the truth. After the chief's words, a quiet tension filled the village square. Amina's mother-in-law stood with her head bowed, feeling a mix of shame and fear. She had never been spoken to in such a way before, and seeing the villagers' eyes on her made her realize how unfair she had been to Amina for so many years. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Amina," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I have been cruel and harsh to you for no reason. I am truly sorry." Amina looked at her mother-in-law, surprised, but her gentle heart did not hold any anger. "It's okay," she replied quietly. "I just want our home to be peaceful." The villagers watched in awe as the mother-in-law slowly began to change her behavior. She started to treat Amina with respect and even helped her with some of the daily chores. The harsh words and constant scolding were replaced with guidance and kindness. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house changed completely. Laughter returned to the small mud hut, and the once heavy and tense air became light and warm. Neighbors noticed the change and smiled as they saw Amina and her mother-in-law working together in harmony. The chief, having seen the transformation, nodded with satisfaction before continuing his journey. He knew that the lesson had been learned and that goodness and kindness had triumphed over cruelty. Amina continued to help others in the village, her gentle heart earning her respect and admiration. And her mother-in-law, having learned the true value of compassion, became a better person. From that day forward, their home was filled with peace, respect, and happiness. The story of the kind-hearted girl and the wicked mother-in-law who met her match became a tale remembered by the villagers for years to come, inspiring others to choose kindness over cruelty.